The small town afternoon. The afternoon sun hung lazily in the sky, spilling warm golden light over the small, quiet town. Streets were lined with tall oak and maple trees, their green leaves moving gently in the summer breeze. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of bread baking in the old bakery on Main Street. Life here was peaceful. Nothing much happened, and the people liked it that way. Children's laughter rang out from somewhere down the street, where a group of kids played tag in a small park. A few older folks sat on their porches, rocking slowly in wooden chairs and waving at anyone who passed. Cars moved by now and then, but never in a hurry. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else in the world. Among the people enjoying this quiet afternoon was Marcus, a bright-eyed, curious 10-year-old boy. Marcus loved the small town. But he also had the restless spirit of someone who dreamed about the big world outside its borders. His best friend was his old red bicycle. The paint was chipped, the seat was a little torn, and the bell sometimes stuck when he pressed it, but to Marcus, it was perfect. That bike had taken him on countless adventures. From exploring the dirt paths near the creek to racing down the steep hill by the school. Today, Marcus was just riding without any particular place to go. The warm air brushed against his face as he pedaled, and the sound of the tires rolling over the pavement was oddly relaxing. He passed by Mrs. Henderson's house, where she was busy watering her flower beds. She smiled and waved, and Marcus waved back. A few houses later, he spotted Mr. Johnson fixing the fence in his yard. The small-town familiarity always made Marcus feel safe and welcome. But just as he turned onto Elm Street, something caught his attention. Parked near the corner store was a police car, its glossy black and white paint gleaming in the sunlight. The flashing lights on top weren't on, but the car's presence stood out. Wasn't often you saw an officer stop in this part of town? Marcus slowed down. His curiosity instantly sparked. He coasted his bike closer, trying not to be too obvious about staring. The officer inside had his arm resting casually on the open window, a pair of dark sunglasses hiding his eyes. He looked relaxed, almost bored, like he was just passing the time. Marcus wasn't shy by nature. In fact, he loved talking to new people, especially when they had interesting jobs. A police officer was definitely someone worth talking to. Maybe the officer had stories about catching bad guys. Or maybe he was in town for some important reason. Without thinking too much, Marcus pulled his bike to the side of the road and let it rest on its kickstand. The metal clicked into place, and a small puff of dust rose from the gravel under his shoes. He brushed his hands against his shorts and stepped forward. Feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on his back, the officer turned his head slightly. As Marcus approached, the corner of his mouth curling into a small smile. "Hey there, buddy," he said, in a friendly tone. "Out, enjoying the day?" Marcus grinned and nodded. "Yeah, just riding around." There was a brief silence, filled only by the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Marcus's curiosity got the better of him. He leaned a little closer to the open window. "Are you here for something important?" he asked. The officer chuckled softly. "Not really, just keeping an eye on things, making sure the town stays safe." Marcus thought that sounded nice, but also a little boring. Wanting to keep the conversation going, he decided to share something he was very proud of. "My dad's in the elite forces," he said suddenly, his voice full of confidence. The words hung in the air for a moment. Marcus expected the officer to be impressed, maybe even a little surprised. Instead, the officer's eyebrows rose slightly behind the sunglasses, and then he laughed. Not in a cruel way, but in a way that made it clear he didn't believe. "Marcus, elite forces, huh?" the officer said with a grin. "That's a big claim for a young man like you." Marcus's smile didn't fade. He nodded seriously. It's true. He's gone a lot because of missions, and he has medals and special gear at home. The officer tilted his head, clearly amused. I see. And what kind of missions does he go on? Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but before he could say anything, the sound of an engine rumbled down the street. Both he and the officer turned to look. A sleek black SUV was approaching slowly, its dark windows hiding whoever was inside. It moved with a certain quiet authority, the kind of presence that made you look twice without knowing why. Heart skipped a beat. Up. He knew that car. The SUV came to a smooth stop a few feet away. The door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in tactical gear. His posture was straight, his steps confident, and even from a distance, it was clear this was someone who commanded respect. Marcus's face lit up. "That's him," he said, his voice filled with pride. The officer straightened in his seat, his smile fading as his eyes focused on the insignia on the man's uniform. His expression shifted from amusement to quiet recognition. This wasn't just any man. This was indeed a member of the elite forces. Marcus had been telling the truth all along. But in that exact moment, before the father even reached the police car, Marcus realized something. This ordinary small-town afternoon was no longer ordinary. Something was about to happen that neither he nor the officer would forget for a very long time. Asterisk. The innocent Clay Marcus had always been proud of his father. To him, his dad wasn't just a parent, he was a hero. Even though his father couldn't talk much about his work, Marcus knew it was something important, something dangerous, and something worth admiring. Standing beside the police car that warm afternoon, Marcus felt that same pride bubbling inside him. The officer seemed friendly, but Marcus could tell he wasn't expecting anything special from this conversation. That made Marcus want to share the one thing that he thought would truly surprise him. With a confident smile, Marcus said, "My dad's in the elite forces." He said it like it was the most normal fact in the world, like saying, "My house has a red door," or "I have a dog." But to Marcus, it wasn't just a fact. It was a badge of honor, something that made his family special. For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. His head tilted slightly, as if he wasn't sure. He heard Marcus right. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. "Elite forces, huh?" He repeated, the words rolling out with a hint of amusement. Marcus nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. He goes on missions all the time." The officer leaned back in his seat, resting one hand on the steering wheel. His sunglasses reflected the boy's small but determined face. "That's a big job for someone's dad," the officer said, his voice half teasing, half curious. "What kind of missions does he go on?" Marcus thought for a moment. He knew he couldn't give details. His dad had told him many times that his work was secret. "I can't tell you exactly," Marcus replied seriously. "But they're really important. He helps keep people safe." The officer chuckled under his breath. "I see." There was something in that laugh, not mean, but doubtful. It was the kind of laugh adults sometimes have when they think a kid is just pretending, making up a big story to impress someone. Marcus had heard that tone before from other kids' parents. They'd smile politely, pat him on the head, and change the subject. But Marcus didn't back down. He kept his chin up and his voice steady. "It's true. He's got medals and uniforms and special gear at home. He's really in the elite forces." The officer shook his head slightly, still smiling. "You sound pretty sure about that." "I am sure," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. The air between them hung with unspoken disbelief. The officer didn't press the matter further, but Marcus could tell he wasn't convinced. It made his stomach twist a little, not in shame, but in frustration. He didn't like when people thought he was making things up. His father's work wasn't a fantasy, was real. Then in the distance, the low rumble of an engine began to grow louder. Marcus's ears perked up instantly. He knew that sound. It was a deep, steady growl, different from the regular cars that rolled through town. He glanced toward the corner, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. The officer noticed him looking. "Friend of yours?" he asked casually. Marcus didn't answer right away. The sleek black SUV appeared from around the bend, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. It rolled down the street at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, but with the quiet confidence of something or someone that didn't need to rush. Marcus's lips curled into a smile he couldn't hide. "That's my dad," he said simply. The officer turned his head toward the approaching vehicle.
"That's your..."
His words trailed off as the SUV slowed and stopped just a few feet away. The engine went quiet. A moment later, the driver's door opened and out stepped a tall man in tactical gear. His boots landed on the pavement with a solid, heavy sound. The sunlight glinted off the insignia on his uniform, a symbol the officer recognized immediately. His posture was strong, his movements precise, his presence commanding. Marcus stood a little taller, pride swelling in his chest. The officer, however, sat up straighter, his earlier smile fading into something else, something closer to respect. Without a single word, the truth of Marcus's claim was standing right there, on the street, and the afternoon was about to take a turn neither of them would forget. The officer's laughter. The police officer leaned back slightly in his seat, the leather of his uniform creaking as he crossed his arms. He still had that same easy smile on his face, but there was something behind it, something Marcus had seen before in other adults. It was the "that's cute" kid look. The officer tilted his head, repeating Marcus's words slowly, almost as if tasting them. "Elite forces." He let out a short chuckle, the kind of laugh someone gives when they think they've just caught a tall tale. Now that's a big story. Marcus didn't smile back. He kept his eyes steady, his voice calm. "It's not a story, sir. It's true." The officer's chuckle grew into a fuller laugh. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but it was clear he didn't believe a word. "So, let me get this straight," he said, leaning forward slightly, resting one arm on the window frame. "You're telling me your dad is one of those guys, the special soldiers they send into dangerous places? The ones we see in movies?" Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Yes, that's exactly what he is." The officer let out a slow whistle and shook his head, the smile still playing on his lips. "Kid, I've been in law enforcement for over a decade. I've met a lot of folks who've been in the military. But the elite forces, that's something else." He paused for a beat, looking Marcus up and down. "You sure you're not just playing around, trying to impress me?" Marcus's heart thumped harder, but not from fear, from frustration. He hated this part. Every time he told someone the truth, they thought it was just a fantasy. "I'm not playing," Marcus replied, his voice firmer now. "He has medals. He's gone for weeks sometimes. He trains in places I can't even say." The officer laughed again, though softer this time. He glanced at the steering wheel, shaking his head like he'd heard it all before. "I like you." "Kid," he said with a grin, "you've got imagination." Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to say more. He wanted to explain everything he knew. He also knew his dad wouldn't like him sharing too much. He had to be careful. The silence that followed was awkward. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves overhead and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Then it happened. The low, steady rumble of an engine echoed from the far end of the street. It wasn't loud, but it carried a certain weta sound Marcus knew better than any. He turned his head toward the corner, and a smile began to creep across his face. The officer noticed. "What's got you grinning?" Marcus didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the approaching vehicle. A black SUV rolled into view, its polished surface reflecting the sunlight in sharp flashes. The windows were tinted, the kind you couldn't see through, no matter how hard you tried. It wasn't speeding, but there was something about the way it moved slow, deliberate, almost commanding, that drew the officer's attention. The laughter faded from his voice. "Who's that?" Marcus's smile widened. "That's my dad." The SUV came to a stop, its engine quieting to a low idle. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The driver's door opened with a solid, heavy click. And out stepped a man who seemed to take up the entire space around him. Broad shoulders, tactical boots, a uniform marked with insignia the officer had only seen in official briefings. His presence was magnetic, his gaze sharp and alert. The officer's sunglasses no longer hid his shifting expression. That easy grin, the one that had laughed at Marcus just minutes ago, was gone. In its place was something entirely different. Recognition. And the first flicker of respect. Marcus holds his ground. The officer's laughter still seemed to hang in the warm afternoon air, even though his voice had gone quiet. It was the kind of laugh that didn't echo with humor, but with disbelief, the kind that wrapped itself around a person like a shadow. Marcus stood there beside the police car, small in size but not in spirit, feeling the weight of that doubt pressing down on him. The sunlight was bright, but it felt cooler now, like a thin cloud had passed over it. A few feet away, his red bicycle leaned on its kickstand, waiting for him. But Marcus didn't move toward it. He stayed exactly where he was, his feet planted firmly on the ground. Inside, he felt two things at once, pride and frustration. Pride, because he knew every word he had spoken was true. Frustration, because, once again, an adult had decided he was just making things up. It wasn't the first time. Marcus remembered the first time someone laughed when he told them about his dad. He had been 8, talking to a neighbor who asked why his father was gone for weeks at a time. When Marcus had said he's in the elite forces, the neighbor's eyebrows had gone up just like the officer's. Now, elite forces. "That's a big story for a little man," the neighbor had said with a chuckle. Like Marcus had told him a joke. That memory still stung, and now the same thing was happening again. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His voice was steady when he spoke. "It's true," he said quietly but firmly. "My dad's in the elite forces." The officer leaned back, his sunglasses reflecting Marcus's small frame. There was still amusement in his voice. "You sound like you really believe that, kid." "I don't just believe it," Marcus replied, his chin lifting slightly. "I know it." The officer smirked, but didn't respond. He looked down the street for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel, as if the conversation was over. But Marcus didn't step back in his mind. He saw his father clearly, the way he looked when he came home from a mission. His uniform smelling faintly of dust and leather, the faint tiredness in his eyes hidden under a calm, steady voice. Marcus thought of the medals in the wooden box on the top shelf of the closet, the ones his father never bragged about but always kept polished. He thought of the early mornings when his dad would leave before sunrise, his boots making quiet thuds on the kitchen floor, his voice low when he said goodbye. Those memories gave Marcus strength now. The air changed before the sound reached them. It was subtle at first, a shift in the stillness, as if the street itself was preparing for something. Then came the low, steady hum of an angina sound Marcus knew like a familiar song. He turned his head toward the corner just as the sleek black SUV appeared. Sunlight danced across its polished surface, and the tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. But Marcus didn't need to. He knew. A slow smile formed on his face. The officer noticed the change in his expression. "What's so funny?" he asked, his tone half curious, half dismissive. "That's my dad," Marcus said simply. The SUV rolled closer, its engine deep and even, like the measured heartbeat of someone unshaken by anything. It pulled to a stop with quiet precision. The officer's smirk wavered. The driver's door opened and a tall man stepped out. The boots hit the pavement with a heavy, certain sound. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight, and even from a distance. There was no mistaking the authority in his movements. The insignia on his uniform caught the light for just a second, clear enough for the officer to recognize instantly. Marcus's father walked toward them, his gaze steady, his presence filling the street in a way that made everything else seem smaller. The officer's body shifted in his seat, its earlier laughter replaced by something else entirely. "Respect, I can continue this part much longer by," expanding the father's walk toward them. The subtle exchange of looks between him and the officer, Marcus's inner thoughts, and the slow shift in tension from disbelief to admiration. The sudden realization for a moment the street seemed to pause. Even the soft rustle of leaves overhead felt quieter, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The tall man who stepped out of the black SUV didn't rush. His movements were calm. Controlled, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has been in situations where panic is not an option. Every step he took toward the police car felt deliberate heavy boots pressing into the pavement. Each sound steady and sure. Marcus's eyes followed him with pride that almost shone brighter than the sunlight on his face. This was the man who had taught him how to throw a baseball, how to ride a bike without falling, and how to keep his promises. But this was also the man the world didn't fully know, the man who disappeared for weeks, sometimes months, only to return with tired eyes, quiet stories, and a box of medals that Marcus wasn't allowed to take to school for show and tell. The police officer, who had been leaning casually against the side of his car just minutes earlier, now shifted his weight. His arms, once folded loosely, dropped to his sides. His jaw moved slightly, as though he was chewing on words he couldn't quite say. He knew that insignia. It wasn't one you could just buy at a surplus store. It wasn't something you could fake with a patch and a good story. No, the symbol stitched onto the chest of Marcus's father's uniform belonged to a unit so specialized that even in law enforcement circles, people only spoke of it. In low, respectful tones, the officer's mind began to race. He remembered the briefings he'd been in years ago. It's the ones that showed photos of these soldiers, men who carried out missions no one would ever read about in the paper. Operations that never made the news, not because they weren't important, but because they were too important. He looked at Marcus again, this small, serious boy who had stood his ground even as a grown man laughed at him. In the pieces began to fall into place. No wonder the kid was so sure. No wonder he hadn't flinched when challenged. The father came to a stop just a few feet from the car. His shadow stretched long in the afternoon light, touching the tips of Marcus's sneakers. He didn't speak right away, and he didn't have to. His presence alone said more than any words could. Marcus glanced up at his dad, his face glowing with a quiet kind of victory. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The officer swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Afternoon, sir," he said, his voice losing its earlier teasing edge. Marcus's father gave a polite nod, his eyes steady on the man before him. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, his tone even but carrying the kind of weight that made people listen. For a moment, there was a silence that felt heavier than the air. The kind of silence where everyone knows something has shifted, even if they can't quite put it into words. The officer glanced once more at the insignia, then back at Marcus, then at the man standing tall beside him. In that instant, his smirk was gone completely. It was replaced by something Marcus had wanted to see all along. Respect, respect, earned. The moment hung in the air like a picture, three figures frozen in the warm afternoon light. Marcus, small but steady, standing between his old red bike and the polished black SUV. His father, tall and unshaken, the faint glint of his elite forces insignia catching the sun. And the police officer, no longer leaning casually in his seat, but sitting upright, his hands resting carefully on the edge of his open window. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like the quiet you hear before a storm. The officer cleared his throat first. "I didn't realize," his voice trailed off. It was rare for him to be short on words. Marcus's father's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't realize what?" he asked calmly, though there was something behind his tone, subtle firmness, like steel under velvet, that your boy was telling the truth. The officer admitted, his voice lower now. Marcus didn't smile. But inside, a warm flicker of satisfaction lit up. He had no desire to embarrass the man. He just wanted his words to be believed. The officer took off his sunglasses. Without the dark lenses hiding his eyes, his expression was clearer, no smugness, no disbelief, only a hint of embarrassment and a great deal more respect. He looked at Marcus again, but this time differently. This time, it wasn't the look an adult gives a kid telling a wild story. It was the look of someone who had underestimated him and was quietly owning up to it. "You've got a good kid," the officer said, turning back to Marcus's father. "I know," the father replied, simply. There was a pause, and then, slowly, the officer extended his hand out of the car window. "I apologize," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "for not taking him seriously." Marcus's father stepped closer, his boots making a muted thud against the asphalt. He took the officer's hand in a firm handshake, the kind that carried strength without trying to crush. The officer didn't flinch. He gripped back with equal firmness, meeting the man's eyes. That handshake wasn't just a greeting, it was a quiet agreement. A shift. A moment where both men understood each other without needing many words. Marcus stood watching, his chest swelling with pride. In his young eyes, that handshake was proof. Proof that his father was every bit the man he knew him to be. Proof that standing his ground had been worth it. The officer released the handshake and gave Marcus one last nod, short, but genuine. "You take care, kid," he said. Marcus nodded back. "You too, sir." As his father guided him back toward the SUV, Marcus glanced over his shoulder. The officer was still watching them, not in suspicion, not in doubt, but in respect. The kind of respect that's earned, not given. The lesson learned. The black SUV's door closed with a deep, solid thud. It was the kind of sound that seemed final, like the closing of a chapter. The engine started, its low rumble breaking the thick stillness of the small-town street. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting in his lap. Through the tinted glass, the world outside looked softer, almost dreamlike in the golden afternoon light. The officer was still by his car, watching them, not out of suspicion now, but with a quiet, almost thoughtful expression. Marcus didn't say anything right away. He glanced at his father, who had both hands on the wheel, his gaze forward. There was no lecture, no speech, no "I told you so." That wasn't his father's way. His father believed in letting moments speak for themselves, and this moment spoke volumes. Marcus thought about how quickly things had changed in just a few minutes. A short ride on his old red bicycle had turned into a test, not just of truth, but of patience and of holding his ground. At first, the officer's laugh had stung. It wasn't loud or mean, but it had carried that same old disbelief Marcus had faced before. He'd felt small then, like his words didn't carry weight. But standing there, refusing to back down, had changed everything. He'd learned something that sometimes people won't believe you until the truth stands right in front of them. And even then, the truth has to speak without anger. without shouting, without trying to force itself. His father's presence had done just that. The officer had learned something too. He'd learned that not all stories are exaggerations, that sometimes a child's pride comes from a very real place, that behind quiet words can stand a reality far bigger than what you first imagine. As they drove away, Marcus looked once more at the officer. The man lifted a hand, not a lazy wave, but a short, respectful one. Marcus lifted his hand in return, a faint smile on his face. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about truth, and the respect that truth can earn when it's finally seen. The SUV turned the corner, the afternoon sun catching the edge of its windows before it disappeared down the street. The small town returned to its calm rhythm, but for three people, something had shifted forever. A hero silenced the SUV moved steadily down the quiet street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road. Marcus leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engine filling the silence between him and his father. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that didn't need breaking. Outside, the town slipped by in soft frames. Mrs. Henderson watering her flowers, the Johnson kids riding their skateboards, an elderly man walking his small dog. Life had gone back to normal for them. But for Marcus, nothing felt quite the same. He looked over at his father, wanting to say something, anything to capture the pride swelling inside him. But the words got stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. How could he explain the way it felt to see someone finally see his dad for who he truly was? How could he explain how that single handshake with the officer had felt like a victory, not just for him, but for the truth itself? His father kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting loosely on his thigh. His face was calm, unreadable to anyone else, but Marcus knew better. He saw the tiny lift at the corner of his dad's mouth, the quiet satisfaction that never needed to be spoken aloud. "You didn't have to come," Marcus said finally, his voice low. "I know," his father replied simply. That was it. No long speech, no boasting, no "I showed him." His father never needed to prove anything with words. He believed that real strength didn't come from telling the world who you wit, came from living it. Marcus thought back to the officer's face, the change from disbelief to respect. He realized that his father hadn't just shown up for him, he had shown up for the truth. He had let his presence speak where Marcus's words hadn't been enough. As they turned onto their street, Marcus caught a glimpse of their house, the familiar porch, the swing swaying slightly in the breeze. The ordinary sight felt almost strange now, as if it didn't quite match the extraordinary weight of the afternoon. They pulled into the driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires marking the end of the ride. His father shut off the engine, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The ticking of the cooling engine was the only sound. Marcus finally opened his door, stepping out into the golden light. His father joined him, locking the SUV with a quiet click. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. Some moments don't need retelling. Some truths are carried best in silence. And as they walked up the steps to their front door, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world might never know every story his father carried, but he did, and that was enough.